Hello, my name is Richard Rudd, and I'm the founder of a wisdom called the Gene Keys. And of course, people always ask me, well, what are the Gene Keys? And I'm not really one of those people that has a predefined answer. In other words, I have as many answers to that question as there are human beings. But for the record, the Gene Keys are a synthesis, and they bring together the scientific approach, art, mysticism, the social sciences, mythology, music, just about any other subject that you can name. And you might wonder how I could make such a grand claim to be synthesizing all of these things. The reason is because the Gene Keys is based on a universal code, and that code comes from the Chinese I Ching. And the I Ching, ancient book and text, 5,000 years ago discovered in China, represents the code of all life. And when you can understand this code, then you have at your fingertips really one of the most extraordinary systems of timeless wisdom that we've ever known. So you can use the Gene Keys both as a practical wisdom and as a deep contemplative tool to expand your consciousness. But above all, the Gene Keys gives you a vision of yourself and your life that's far, far beyond what you might ever have considered possible for yourself. In the modern materialistic world, we've completely lost touch with the magical roots of the cosmos. We tend to see life now through the logical scientific brain. And that's fascinating, and it's revealing, and it's very useful. But it's also hugely limiting. Logic itself is self-limiting. Logic, for example, can never fully understand a concept like infinity. Since logic is based on cause and effect. So how can it understand something like infinity, which is beyond cause and effect? You're always going to hit the same problem, the same paradox. And, my kids always ask me that question, well, not always, but sometimes, what was before the beginning of the universe? And whatever logical answer I try to give them, they're always going to come back to me with that same thing. Well, what was before that, Daddy? But what was before that? Logic can't penetrate the veils of the mystery, of the deep mystery. It's limited by its own logic. So in this new course, I'm going to present something to you that is alogical. It's beyond logic. So where we are going, logic breaks down. The ancients called this world that we live in a Maya, an illusion fabricated by the mind. And truth, they also say, is something that can only be known by direct experience, never by thinking or reasoning. They say that the mind is an instrument of the Maya, so how can you understand the Maya with an instrument that is of the Maya? It's of the illusion. So you're going to have to step beyond the mind. And I don't have any scientific credentials. So if you're looking for scientific verification of all this wisdom, all I can say is that science hasn't caught up yet, and it may never catch up. However, I do have one thing that does give me a bit of an edge, and that is that in my early 20s I had an experience of truth with a capital T. I had a direct experience of a truth that was so vast it can't be comprehended by the mind. I experienced the unity of all things. So there I was, living a quiet, contemplative life, and one morning I woke up and everything was just different. I know I'm never going to be able to fully explain and put into words what I experienced, but my body was flooded with light, and it poured through me, and it emanated and radiated from every pore of my being. And the light was not physical light, not like the light that we see. It carried intelligence. It was alive, and it connected me to everything, to anything. And my mind shone like crystal. Anything I wanted to know, instantly I could know, from the past, from the future. And I saw everything all at once in a great sweep. It was as though I was being seen through, because I, Richard Rudd, was no more in that space. There was just this presence, this eternal presence beyond time and beyond space. And it was a life-changing experience. It was a life quake and it lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and I didn't sleep. And there was no sleep in that world. And it shook me to the roots of my being, and it redefined my life, and it's reshaped my decisions and my destiny from that time on. You know, I was going to live a so-called ordinary life, and instead I end up becoming this seeker of truth, like many of us, and sometimes also a teacher of truth. You know, I had tasted the beyond, and I wanted more. And now I'm sitting here before you exactly 20 years later, and my search has led me all over the world. It's led me to many teachers and teachings, you know, from ancient times to more modern. And at a certain time when I was ready, a huge book came through me, and I called it The Gene Keys, Unlocking the Higher Purpose Hidden in Your DNA. And it took me 7 years to write. And inside it, I encapsulated everything that happened to me, more or less, and all that I saw in those 3 days back in the early 90s. So the gene keys are a code, and that code is the same code as your DNA. And I've spoken about this elsewhere. It's through the mathematics of the code that it's a direct correlation. So I'm not going to go into that now. But in my experience, the light of consciousness that I experienced and that others have also experienced, it came from within the cellular and genetic structure of who I am. And that's where the gene keys comes from. They're a poet's exploration of human DNA. They're a mystical exploration of the full and unrealized potential hidden in the 64 codons that make up our genetic code. And one of the things that came to me as I discovered the grand synthesis of the gene keys is the notion that we humans have access to a whole spectrum of consciousness. In other words, there are dimensions available to us that lie beyond the physical senses. And that's what this series is all about. It's about where we're headed as a species. It's about our very highest potential. And normally, when we talk about having potential, we're thinking about how successful we can be in the outer world, you know, to find love, to be wealthy, to be materially and emotionally successful. You know, to be happy and prosperous. But here in this series, I'm going to go far beyond that. We're going to go beyond individual happiness. We're going into the deep mystery. So after my experience, and over the past 20 years, I've sought out people who've attained states of consciousness like the one I experienced. And I've read about them, and I've studied them extensively, and I've met some of these people in the flesh. And I've heard stories that would make most people think twice about whether the teller might be kind of mad. The thing is that these stories occur in all cultures, and they revolve around the saints or the holy people rather than the statesmen or the scientists or the geniuses. And most of these stories are instantly dismissed by the skeptics with their logical worldview. You know, miracles are generally relegated to the domain of fantasy or delusion, or they're seen as the kind of quaint perspective of a more primitive indigenous culture that we've now evolved beyond. And, you know, such people are not always easy to approach, these miraculous people, these, you know, extraordinary types. They're not always easy to approach with a logical mind. You know, you really have to meet one in order to feel the palpable presence of these other dimensions. And I'm going to be sharing some of these stories and these dimensions with you throughout this program. In fact, let's begin with one right now. And you might have heard this one. It's from Ram Dass, spiritual teacher from America. Lovely man, now coming towards the end of his days. And his teacher, Neem Karoli Baba, nicknamed Maharaji. And the story more or less is, I'll keep it short, is about Ram Dass when he'd been in these higher devotional states from being around his teacher. And then one day he had to go down into the valleys, and I don't know what his reason was, I guess to maybe renew his visa or something. And anyway, he was in all his regalia, his robes and his mala, and, you know, he was in his holy state. And he was in a little place taking lunch, and in his kind of yogi costume, and the lunch came, and with the lunch, which was kind of vegetarian, was a little chocolate biscuit, that they put on the side. And, he says, that definitely wasn't yogi food. And so anyway, he, without anyone in the restaurant seeing, he managed to eat the biscuit, and enjoy it. And anyway, and then several weeks later, when he'd gone back up into the mountains and, to meet it up with his teacher, Maharaji, the first thing he says to Ramdas, when he sees him is, "So did you enjoy the biscuit?" And it's just small things like that make your mind just open, because you see, our real potential is off the map. It's actually unlimited. I'll say that again. Your true potential is unlimited. It's limitless. But for most people, that's just too much to stomach. Science and logic prevails. Of course, I'm limited by my mortality and by my body and by the material world and its laws. But the irony here is that science even now suspects strongly that matter itself is porous, and that other dimensions may really be the only thing that can explain the workings of the universe. So anyway, let's just begin here with this concept that your potential is limitless. Your very opening to that concept is the beginning of your journey into this magical world that lies beyond our senses. And if you can't get past this concept, then please don't waste your time here. This program isn't for you, and neither are the Gene Keys. But if even a small part of you can open to the possibility that anything is possible in this universe, then this program may well open you up to a whole new world.